Welcome to Faithful Deconstruction. I'm Jessie Cruickshank.
And I am Rowland Smith, and we're joined by our guest, Toby Armstrong, who is a pastor in Denver and a longtime friend. We used to be on staff together.
Yes, we did.
Well. So thanks for being here this morning.
My pleasure.
Well, in our last episode, we talked about just what deconstruction is and kind of some definitions there, and how the story in Genesis 11 of the Tower of Babel kind of gives us an interesting picture of what deconstruction could be like. And for me, when I think about the people in the Tower of Babel, I wonder, like, that first morning when they woke up, right? What did that feel like? The day before, you know, you're working on your project, you're laying your bricks, you're dealing with your foreman, you're dealing with your friends, like you have all of the things that a construction environment involves, and, you know, things not being shown up on time, you know, this brick was put in the wrong place. I mean, I just can imagine what the scene was like. And then you go to sleep and you wake up the next day and everything's different. Suddenly you're not even speaking the same language as everyone else. And just how traumatic and disorienting that might feel, like that moment of everything that you thought that you knew and the way that you existed with people and the relationships that you had and the way you understood yourself in the world is just broken. It's just gone. And what that moment would have been like. And so I wanted to have a conversation today about how we respond when the world falls apart. How do we respond, and how do we understand and empathize with people about what this actual experience of deconstruction feels like? Mm-hmm. And you had some great quotes in your book.
Yeah, I mean, this is a book that we've used in a group that meets at my house Monday nights. We just got done with it, and I think it's one helpful tool and resource. Brian McLaren, a lot of people will be familiar with, but it's Faith After Doubt. And there's one interesting part where he's looking at paradigm shifts. You know, he says, for many of us, faith is our map of reality. So you think of a map. It's a map of the universe. And academics often call these mental maps paradigms. And so when a paradigm fails, then we need to seek a new one. And so we go through what we call a paradigm shift, which we use that kind of phrase a whole lot. We throw it around. But then when you think about science, for example, you don't think about paradigm shifts because you think science is like, it's pure and it's proven and there's formulas and there's math and there's all these
Only
things.
people who aren't involved in science think that way, but anyway.
But for a lot of us, it's like science is this proven thing. And it was interesting because Albert Einstein had this language when he talked about experiencing with the coping of data that took him off the edge of his scientific map. So you think of Einstein as like knowing all these formulas and what's true and what's not true and all this. So he would fall off of his map, you know. And this is his quote. It said, it was as if the ground had been pulled out from under one, with no firm foundation to be seen anywhere upon which one could have built. So this loss of your paradigm, this loss of your foundation and your map. And then McLaren goes on to say, if the loss of a scientific map or model creates anxiety, how much more does the loss of a religious worldview? And so I think that's what we're talking about. You know?
Yeah, I mean, Toby, what have you experienced the emotionality is, or the state of being is for people who've come to you in different places, or maybe even in your own spaces of deconstruction? What's that felt like?
Yeah, so I've gone through my own process of deconstruction and reconstruction, I don't know, throughout my entire journey. But also, you know, just some context, I've been ministering to and working with Millennial and Gen Z for over 20 years. And I would say that they're, while not the only audience, the only demographic that's experiencing this, I would say that proportionally, studies have shown that they're experiencing it more than previous generations. And for a lot of different reasons, but they usually come to me, and we engage in conversations, usually as a response to trauma that they've experienced. And so what I would say that makes their demographic and generation a little bit different, and the world that we're living in right now a little bit different, is whereas people in other contexts and times may experience deconstruction as a way of like, this doesn't make sense to me anymore in my context. I need to think this through. Now they're deconstructing, at least the people that I talk to, out of, I've been abused or experienced abuse, and I can't live in this community anymore. And then it gets projected onto God, or, there's a spiritual aspect to that of, if this is what God's like, I don't know that I want a relationship with that kind of God, or, this doesn't help me. And so they often come with a lot of pain. And that's been my own experience as well, is that my experience with deconstruction has been some of the, purely maybe theoretical, theological, intellectual, but the majority recently in the last decade or so has been driven by trauma. So I think that's, yeah.
And, I mean, you're one of the most interesting church pastors I know, church planters I know, because you're actually a church planter that has a pretty cool building, and you refuse to meet in it.
Yeah.
You planted a church and a coffee shop instead.
Yep.
Is that kind of connected to this, this PTSD maybe that
absolutely.
they feel with the institution?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was part of our journey. We didn't go with full intention to not meet in the building. In fact, we tried at the very early stages of this kind of community that we were building to meet there. And the feedback that we received, we did a large demographic study, and this may just be more heightened maybe in our context of South Denver, the Denver metro area. But in our context, a lot of the feedback we received from the people we were trying to have conversations with and build a community with was that I have trauma related to institutional church environments, and it's not a safe place for me. And so when I walk in the doors of that building, I'm triggered. I have, all this, these things that happen to me in which when I walk in that building, I have an emotional response. And it's not a place where I feel connected to God. It's not a place where I feel like I can engage in authentic community. And so we had to take that before just as a community and say, what are we going to do with this?
Yeah.
Right? And there are other aspects to it as well of just, okay, it's not a safe place. I don't feel welcomed in an institutional environment, but it's also just not, in our context, a norm. So people my age probably either they've spent a small amount of time in church communities, buildings, but the majority of the time they don't spend there. They don't find community there. So if you're looking to build authentic community, that kind of construct, I feel like, or wineskin, if you use biblical language, we're in the midst of a shift, a paradigm shift there.
No, and I think what you're saying that I find really fascinating, and part of what just makes me upset about the whole conversation around deconstruction when it gets really shaming and negative is that it is a new wineskin, right? These are people who are trying to find a way towards God as they're trying to get healthy.
Yeah.
Right? They're trying to connect towards God in an authentic way where God doesn't remind them of the trauma or the abuse that they've suffered. And we used to, I think in ages past, talk about deconstruction in a positive way. I mean, we didn't use that word, right? Because deconstruction sounds very negative. And now, we feel there's a lot of people who think it's a negative thing. And some people, hang on to the word as a sort of not deconstruction, but destruction. But we used to talk about it like new wineskin. We used to talk about it in a positive way. Yeah. And, I like to say that anthropologists call it liminality, sociologists call it deconstruction, developmental psychologists like me call it transition. Paul just called it discipleship and sanctification. And I think God calls it a weekday because it's just part of the natural rhythm. But, for the people that you minister to, when they have this experience and they're trying to find their way towards God, like how do you as a pastor help them? Maybe what's helped you keep your connection with God through your different stages and times of deconstruction? Like I think our response is just super critical.
Yeah.
So how do you respond towards them? What's helpful?
I think one of the things that I've recognized, and some of this has been because of my own journey. So I would say because I think one of the challenges of today in this environment in which deconstruction has risen to a very prominent place, pastors who haven't experienced any of that, they haven't experienced trauma.
Is that? I don't know of any pastor who hasn't experienced trauma, but
I
maybe
think
they're out there.
in an institutional church environment, right? So, and I would also say that most pastors probably have, but maybe they haven't gone through a process of counseling, a healthy process, a holistic process that addresses the theological challenges, the emotional challenges, the spiritual challenges, all that kind of stuff. If you haven't gone through that, then you can respond in an unhelpful way.
Right. You probably respond to them the way you're responding to your own trauma.
Right. And
shove it down and make it go away.
I think that there are two major responses that I see from pastors. One is the institutional response, right? Because when you come as say I'm just, a regular church member goer, and I come and I talk to my pastor and I say, I'm having doubts. Well, that triggers a survival response in us as pastors, right? Especially in a season in which the institutional church as a whole is under fire and we've got challenges from all kinds of different places, right? And so we have this survival response of, I need to protect the institution. I can't have, if this person leaves, then maybe a bunch of other people will leave with them. Maybe they'll introduce questions that I don't have answers for. Maybe, so we respond institutionally. The second response that I see is relationally. You can respond out of the relationship that you have with that person and say, wow, I care about you as a person. How are you doing? What kind of emotions are you experiencing? How, as a friend, how can I be there with you in this moment and just hold space for the sacredness of what it is that you're experiencing as a human being? Understand that you're made in the image of God, and I care about you. So tell me what's going on. Those are two very different responses. And one, I believe, is more helpful, and one is very unhelpful. One does what I see Jesus doing, of he enters into the pain of a person, the shame of a person, what they're experiencing, and just sits with them in that, right? And then the other says, we can't have you doubting. Like that's like, from a survival perspective, you're going to infect the rest of this congregation with your doubt, and I may not be, so it's a very different viewpoint. And so for me, I think it's important to recognize, and this is where pastors need to do some of their own deconstruction. How am I responding? Is it helpful? Is it Christ-like? Is it kingdom-shaped? And if it's not, then we need to think through our responses and do some own personal work to be able to be helpful for somebody. Because ultimately, if our goal is to help them be closer to Jesus, to experience the love of God, we have to meet them in the moment, meet them in the reality, the authentic moment of what they're experiencing, in order to, ever possibly be helpful to them in their journey.
I'm guessing because you don't want the institutional response at the outpost, your church community, that you have learned some things in how you respond that may be different than how you used to respond, even coming into student ministry, where pastors are supposed to have all the answers. I'm guessing now you can say, I don't know,
Yeah.
But just journey with people. So can you riff on that a little bit? Like what's the culture like being a pastor that can say, I'm not really sure, but we're just going to keep pointed toward Jesus, and figure that out.
I think so. To rewind a little bit, I think some of this goes into our view of life and our perspective on God and humanity just in general. And I think we lose sight of that. We get very kind of laser focused on this is the only thing that exists. We do that in Christendom a lot. We forget the fact that we're all humans who, through no choice of our own, got dropped by a stork, if you believe the Disney narrative, right? Onto this planet that's like hurtling through space, and we have to survive. And we create responses. We create constructs, shelters, if you will, as a means of survival. And some of them are more helpful than others. And so with that kind of viewpoint on it, we can recognize that all of life is a journey of survival, and we encounter different things as our environment changes through no choice or fault of our own, and we have to respond to that. And so I think that viewpoint helps to shape maybe a little bit of how we respond, because our perspective on this is totally different. If you can let go of maybe what you view of this responsibility that's been put on us by maybe our perspective of ecclesiology that says that you as the pastor are responsible for the health, the wellness, the success, the sustainability of your church community. And you can realize that all of this is being held together by God, and you're invited into it. You can respond differently. So in our situation, I would say that with that in mind, I recognize that I'm invited to partner with God in the work that He's already doing. Right. And that takes some of the pressure off, but it also introduces a whole other level of anxiety.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. So with that, I would say that we have a different perspective, and the perspective gives us what I think is a more helpful response, because we have permission to say, well, I didn't create this. I've been invited into this. I was born into the same world that you are. I don't have any answers that you don't have. But what I will say is that yet again, if we go back to that institutional versus relational perspective, an institutional response to that as a leader, I characterize as a gatekeeper, right? Yeah. And we've all experienced this, I would say. We've all run into them. We've all been a gatekeeper at some point. So that's just my own authenticity. I've done this as a way of surviving, right? To keep everything together. But if you look at Jesus' life and the way that He interacted with people, a non-controlling, non-coercive presence in people's life, He acted more as a guide. Right. Let me show you a different way. Come follow me, right? I've walked a path that I think would be helpful for you. And so with that different perspective in mind, now we're able to position and posture ourselves as leaders differently. So that we don't have to be a gatekeeper, we can be a guide.
And I know that's one of
one of
the main values at the Outpost that I love is that you guys are guides, not gatekeepers.
Yeah. And so all of this kind of orbits around maybe a different perspective. And I think that's some of what Brian was talking about in his book, and some of what you're highlighting is that we have these paradigm shifts. And I think one of the biggest things that we do with people in deconstruction is to say, I give you permission as a human to feel all the things you're feeling, to unpack it with me without judgment. And we trust that God's presence is involved in that. The Holy Spirit's guiding us in that process. And because of that, one of the things we've been told throughout Christianity and even theological study is like, you don't get to make sense of God. Like there are prescribed ways of making sense of God, and that you can only make sense of God those ways. We can unpack the literal list of the ways that we do this in Christianity. But one of the most helpful things that allows people to come to a place where they actually lean into relationship with God is saying that there's not just one way to make sense of God. And I'm just going to sit with you in this place as you unpack what you're experiencing, how it's making you feel, how you're making sense of God in this moment. And it's really a journey, right? So let's take a step together. Let's just sit, rest, and then we'll take a step together. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So what I hear you saying is that, just combine some of that and what you said just a few minutes ago is that we can't take people through that if we haven't been through it ourselves, or even if it's a different kind of deconstruction, until we have deconstructed maybe our responsibility as a pastor or as a leader or even as a disciple maker, whether you're responsible for 500 or responsible for one, when we misunderstand that and the trust is in ourselves to be able to answer questions or know how to navigate things, we have to deconstruct that and find a greater faith in God, a greater faith in Jesus, Holy Spirit to lead us into truth, that better positions us to respond better, in a more healthy way, relationally with other people. So one of the questions that I have then is, sometimes people are deconstructing and they feel trauma around the fact their pastor didn't have an answer, right? Because they went in and they wanted a solution. They had a certain expectation. And then let's say the pastor responds in a healthy way, but it's not the way they wanted, and they feel very let down, maybe even abandoned. I mean, obviously, that would be triggering a whole bunch of origin story and family system issues. But people who respond that way to someone who's holding space, what do you recommend then, or how do you think about that long play, the long journey of, I'm a human and I'm not perfect as a leader or as a disciple maker. Okay, you just interpreted my lack of perfection, not moral failure, but lack of perfection, as something very disruptive, disorienting, and maybe even using the word trauma around it. How would you coach us as we walk this messy road forward in community?
I think for me, and this has just been, as we've been unpacking some of this comes from self-reflection and conversation around what has been helpful and what's not been helpful, right? And so sometimes as a group, you can just say, okay, what's been helpful, what's not been helpful? And you start to, maybe see some breadcrumbs of a pathway forward. But in our perspective, I think we have to first recognize something even like behind that, pastors and leaders, we've been coached into this idea in which we're expected to have all the answers, and that we're the sole guide for everybody in our church. And I think that's toxic and unhelpful at its core. If I can, at a very baseline level say, okay, just because the Holy Spirit's inviting me to sit with this person in their pain, doesn't mean that I have to have any answers for them. I'm invited into a moment in which God is meeting with those people, and I am an image bearer who is being present in that moment with them, right? Now, that begins, I would hope, an encounter of healing, where healing begins to take place, or even just the process of grief, when you give someone permission to sit in their grief and say, this happened to me, I don't know what to do, I am disoriented, and you just give them permission to sit in that place and for them to experience love. Then after that, the step becomes, okay, I can see that you're disoriented. We need to help you connect to somebody who has experienced that disorientation and has found a healthy path forward, right? So that's formed a perspective in our community in which there's not one guide.
Right.
everybody's a guide to some degree, right? Everybody's walked paths and can say, hey, wait a minute, I've walked through that. And if you want to walk with me, I'll unpack maybe some of the steps that I took, some of the detours that I think that you should avoid, the pitfalls, the challenges. And that's a more helpful response because it takes the pressure off of me as a spiritual leader in our community to say, I don't have to be the guide for everybody. I'm not the right guide for everybody. I'm a middle-aged white guy from Canada. I have my own experiences. I have my own prejudices. I have my own challenges. I have my own trauma. Sometimes if the expectation is I'm going to be a guide for everybody, well, my trauma may trigger your trauma. It may not be the right fit, right? And if we can take the permission off and realize that in community, in communitas, we have a host of people that God is working through, and that when someone's in the process of deconstruction, our role in that is to sit in that holy moment and be there with them, and then to help them hear the voice of God, which says, number one, let's reconnect to the Holy Spirit, who is our guide, ultimately, but let's connect you to somebody who you feel comfortable with, who you feel safe with, who you, like, that's the onus is on them to select a guide, right? And in that, there's also no judgment of like, hey, we walk a path together and I realize that God is taking me in a different direction or this isn't helpful for me anymore, then you find a new one, right? Without judgment, without criticism. And so to me, that's what I think is a more helpful way of looking at this. But it's an entirely different framework of spiritual community than maybe the hierarchical view of like the pastor is the one who's been to seminary and has all the answers and sets the rules and the expectations. And in a lot of ways, I think tragically, we identify too often with Jesus and not enough with the confused disciples, right? And so we put ourselves in this position of, oh, I'm to be Jesus to these people, instead of, well, wait a minute, I'm a human too. And I'm experiencing this as we go along as well. And while God may have gifted me to help create and in some ways facilitate this community, I'm not supposed to be the guide for everybody.
I love the humility and the posture of that, because
it seems scary to me. I mean, not to me personally. I know it would be scary
It's scary.
The pastorate.
Yeah.
Right? Because even unintentionally, pastors are shipped out of seminary degrees with, okay, now you need to go, be the leader and make sure this thing is stable and secure and people aren't freaking out and all of that. And it's not even fair to put on pastors to do that. If they were taught to be guides and messed up disciples that, just have a little bit more maybe awareness of how to stay connected with Jesus, that's their part in everything, it would have solved so much.
Yeah. But at the same time, I don't want to like project this idea of like, oh, this alternate way is perfect. It's really messy, you know? And there is more fear in it because like we don't have a concrete set of instructions of like, here's how you disciple somebody, as if that ever existed and worked. But I think the question now becomes, okay, the world has changed. Our environment, I would say, and this is what I point to for a lot of folks, is the millennial and Gen Z generation are having a completely different experience with the world than any other generation. And so they're making sense of God in different ways. Through no fault of their own. They didn't ask to be born at this time with this, in this environment. But then the question becomes, okay, if they're having a different experience with the world, then we need a different way as a community of Christ followers of, creating a spiritual environment for them. How do we make sense of God that's helpful? How do we heal that's helpful? And one of the things that we've discovered is just that those other ways, those other approaches aren't helpful. They were helpful for a time in a different, a different world that we lived in. but not for now. And so, yeah, it's messy. Yeah, it's challenging. It's not perfect. I'm not saying that's perfect. I'm just saying that I think this, as we're interacting with people, we're seeing a lot of fruit interacting with people who are in deconstruction of saying they have a different concept of Jesus. And I think that's the important part, is that when you sit with somebody in the pain, they have a different view of Jesus based on their encounter with you than when you sit with somebody in their pain from an institutional perspective of, well, I don't know if you're really allowed to think that way, or we start to critique their experience or their emotions or their beliefs, instead of just sitting with them. And that's a hard thing to let go of, I think, because, well, now there's a whole other host of problems that come up with this, right? If you're not sitting institutionally,
Right.
well, you lose control, and there is going to be mess. And well, another question becomes like, okay, say somebody connects to a guide and they're not like helping them connect with Jesus, they're connecting with something else.
Right.
Right? So I don't want to pretend like this is just a perfect way, but it's what we found to be helpful given our context and how people are going through things.
But at the edge of what we can control and what we can manage, on the other side of that line is faith, right?
Yeah.
Faith doesn't exist in the space that we can control and manage because we don't need it. It's not faith. Faith is on the other side. And so what I like about what you're saying is just that if our initial response, and we can maintain it going forward, is to not step into that space of control, to manage their deconstruction. But personally, having greater faith in Jesus, greater faith in the Holy Spirit, to be the author of their journey, then hopefully we have enough faith to hold space with them, so that as a community we can come around them and help them not lose their faith. So I think of disciple making as a community activity, community group project. So holding that
a messy
space.
one.
a
messy one. Yeah.
As always, God is with humanity, right? It's always messy.
Yeah.
So, Roland, what's your hope as we think about how we hold space with people when the world falls apart?
as a pastor and involved, in leadership, like Toby, I think, like what we've been talking about, I have a totally different view now of what it means to be a pastor. I mean, I like the title and I don't like the title. I mean, people will do the Pastor Rowland. Hey, here's Pastor Rowland, and sometimes I'm just like, I don't want to be that. I want to be the messy disciple. And maybe I've been to school and studied some theology and things like that is helpful for the journey. But I don't want a hierarchical approach to that. I want hey, you've studied this. Like, what do you think? I'd rather be in that kind of posture. So my hope is that more pastors, church leaders, volunteers that are leading things could see themselves as guides and not gatekeepers for their church. That they could release some of that weight and expectation. I found it to be freeing in the messiness. It is messier, but it's freeing. So I'm hoping more leaders can just kind of be guides.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us here at Whoology. If you're interested in some of those resources to teach people to be guides, please check out our Ordinary Discipleship series, whether the book or the online class. And that wasn't a prompt. You guys are just, we just believe and hope the same thing. So very organic way. But we all believe that and carry that value. And if you're interested in more resources, we have some. But we want to thank you for joining us on Faithful Deconstruction and how we just journey with one another through deconstruction so we don't lose our faith.
Yeah, and thank you, Toby.
Thank you, Toby.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you for tuning in for Faithful Deconstruction. As a listener to this podcast, we wanted to make available to you a free download entitled 6 Questions of Faithfulness. They are questions that help you both honor God and the journey you're on. You are not alone and you're not lost, even if it might feel like it. Go to whoology.co for access to our free resources today.